Okay, it's about time for us to get started. We appreciate the fact that all of you are here. We're in a study of love and marriage, courtship, and we're delighted that you're with us for this study. Today we're talking about a marriage, what frazzles, fractures, and fuses. Picture, if you can, a young couple that's planning to get married, and the thrill of being loved, the excitement of planning a wedding, the encouragement of friends, and the smell of roses. All of these make young people today look forward to getting married, and they just fill with joy and happiness. Now, we have a strong tradition here in America that says a boy meets a girl, they get married, and they live happily ever after. That's the ideal. But how is it in reality? I'm afraid they will not say that they lived happily ever after, but they live scrappily ever after. In the picture of marriage that we see in our day, it's not always a good thing, it's not always a happy time, but of course that's our desire. But we have to do some work and preparation to have that kind of marriage. Now, a little girl was talking to her mother one day and telling her the story of Cinderella. She had heard the story a number of times and was trying to tell her mother that story. And her mother began to get in a big hurry and thought she'd help her out. And she said, and they live happily ever after. She said, no, Mommy, they got married. Sometimes those two things don't go together. And so they live scrappily ever after. Now, oftentimes marriages do work beautifully. The people are happy, they have a good marriage, they'd recommend it to other people. But then sometimes it doesn't work out that way. It doesn't lead to happiness for the man or the woman. Most of us are aware of the statistics that we've heard through the years that tell us that marriage is in trouble today. Back when I began to preach, back before the flood sometime, the statistic that I remember was out of every 4 marriages, there was 1 divorce. I don't remember ever hearing that out of 5, but it began with me with 4 marriages, 1 divorce. Now, it has gotten worse than that over the years. After a number of years, we began to hear out of 3 marriages, there was 1 divorce. And then after a number of years, got down to 2 marriages and 1 divorce. Now, that's a little misleading because when we say out of every 2 marriages there's 1 divorce, it suggests that one of those 2 is going to divorce. But that was not necessarily true. Many of the divorces came from people who've been married a long time, not just those 2, but many divorces came from those who had been married many years. Do you remember Ann Landers? She used to have a syndicated column in the newspaper about every day. And she would answer questions that people would ask. And they would ask about marriages and all sorts of problems in regard to marriage. And she would answer those questions for people. And then Ann Landers divorced her husband after 36 years of marriage. After giving advice to people about how to have a good marriage, she divorced after 36 years. So you see, there are many people in various circumstances of life who divorce. In congregations, there are situations like that. Even among people who believe the Bible and want to do what the Bible says, we have found that there are people who divorce, not according to the instructions given in the Bible, but divorce for some other reason, and then remarry. We need to be impressed with what Jesus said in Matthew 19. In the first few verses, you remember that he was asked, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? And Jesus taught that that was not true. People can't just marry for any and every cause. And in verse 9, he said, and I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. And whoso marrieth her, which is put away, doth commit adultery. We need to be impressed with what Jesus said there, because in many cases in our day, people seemingly pay no attention to what Jesus said. They think God wants me to be happy. and come up with all sorts of excuses, and they think they justify themselves by just getting married again, regardless of what God said. And so we need to have that passage impressed upon our hearts. Now, we're talking today about some things that frazzle, fracture, and fuse a marriage. First of all, there are some things which cause a marriage to be frazzled. That's about like a shirt or a dress. When the threads become loose, it becomes frazzled. Marriages can be like that. Marriages today develop out of a different dating situation, and that's one of the reasons we have marriages that are falling apart. In former times, back in the day when people lived on farms, things were quite different in various ways. Back at that time, the people would grow up knowing each other. They lived on farms, and their families had lived on farms for generations, and they knew everybody. Somebody across the road may be impressed by a little boy on this side or a girl right down the road, but they knew everybody. At that time, they went to school together. It might have been a little one-room schoolhouse, but they went to school together. They knew each other. They married those whom they know. But that's not the case anymore. In many instances today, young people don't know the person they're going to marry. In the past, they just met them here and there, and they get married, though they don't really know each other. Today, people don't live on farms like they used to, and they didn't live close together like that, didn't know each other. They moved into towns, big towns in many cases, and the young people may not necessarily go to the same school. In a big city, there are many schools, and they go to different schools. They graduate from high school and go off to college, and they meet somebody there. And then pretty soon they want to get married. Or they go off to work somewhere, and they meet someone and only knew them a few days or weeks, and they want to get married. That's a picture of the situation today. And with people getting married when they don't really know each other, it places a great strain on the marriage, and oftentimes it does not last. In many instances now, not only do the families not know each other, but the young people who are getting married don't know each other, and they don't know the families of the other person. And in many cases, when they get into a situation like that, they find out some things after marriage that they would not have accepted if they had waited a while and had known something about the person that they are marrying. A number of years ago, I read a sermon by Brother Batselberry Baxter. Don't remember the sermon, but I imagine it was on marriage and divorce and remarriage. But he told about a young couple that had just married. They're in the church building. The preacher has pronounced them husbands and wife. And after the preliminaries inside the building, they came to the front of the building to leave, to go on their honeymoon. People were lined up on the walkway outside, ready to throw rice on them. That used to be true. And as they're coming out the front door, the young lady says to her husband, "Now, what did you say our last name is?" There are too many marriages like that. People don't really know each other. And when they get married, when they don't really know each other, they run into problems after they get married, and they learn some things about each other. And if they had waited, they probably would not have married that person. So one of the problems that we face is the fact that people get married when they don't really know each other. Also, everything in our modern world moves at a very rapid pace today. Back at the time we've been talking about, when they lived on farms, they didn't move very rapidly in anything. They didn't have automobiles. They rode in little carts and horses and whatever, and they didn't move very rapidly in anything. But then as things began to change and they began to get married to people they did not know, the world changed. The automobile came along, and people moved at a much faster rate. Back at that time, they might not go very far on a date, just enough time to go to a barn down the road here somewhere where they had a taffy pool or something like that. Probably most people haven't heard of that, but back at that time, they would make candy together, and they call it a taffy pool. Well, today they're in an automobile. They go to pick up that young lady. I don't know if any of you remember this or not. It's before my day as well. You'd have to ask some of these older people about that. Back at that time, when a young man went to pick up a girl with his horse and buggy, he picked up somebody else as well, mama. Did you know that back at that time, in many cases, when the young man picked up a young lady for a date, mama went with him? Now, you can see that that would be a lot safer type of courting than today if mama's along with them, and the fact that they're riding in a horse and buggy, too, rather than automobiles. Today, young people are in automobiles, and that poses some dangers, real dangers. They drive somewhere, they stop in the darkness somewhere. That young man and young lady are together there. Before you know it, they're studying biology by Braille. And that poses a bigger problem. And the first thing you know, they're doing that which should be reserved only for marriage. And that's a great danger today in courtships. We need to go back and impress upon our young people the passages in which the Bible teaches us to be pure. In 1 Timothy 5:22, Paul said, "Keep thyself pure." And in Galatians 6, verses 7 and 8, he said, "Be not deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. For he that soweth to the flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption, and he that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting." The point is, we'll reap what we sow. And if young people get involved in things on a date that ought to be reserved for marriage, there will be a harvest time. There will be problems that come. And so our dating situation today is much different from it was from the time when people lived on farms and knew everybody, and they went in horse and buggies here and there. It's amazing that there are many young people today who can withstand the pressures and temptations on a date like that. There are some young people that come through it fine. They want to do what is right, and of course they're to be commended for that. And then there's another concern that young people need to be concerned about. When they're thinking about getting married, they also need to give attention to what's going to happen after they marry. If people are not married and one of them should die, now it might be hurtful to them, but it won't be like getting married and then having a wife or a husband to die. Those of us who've gone through that experience can tell you it is a heartbreaking thing. It really is. And sometimes people say, I don't really know what it's like. Never have lost a mate like that. And I say, you don't want to know either. You really don't want to know what it's like. But people don't know that until they get married. And one of the things we have to think about is, after you get married, you might have a mate that dies. And that brings a lot of heartache and sorrow. And then there's the possibility of a nagging and bickering marriage. If people are not prepared properly and do not determine that they're going to get along well, they might get into bickering and fussing and fighting. Solomon tells us in Proverbs 27 and verse 15, a continual dropping in a little rain on a very rainy day is like a contentious woman. Now, if a woman or a man really should be contentious, that can cause bickering and fussing and fighting in a marriage. So that's one of the things that people need to think about. If they get married, unless they're doing the right thing, they may get into fussing and bickering and fighting, and it may lead to problems. Even if they stay together, if they have that type of marriage, it will not be a happy situation. So this is not said to encourage people not to get married. Marriage is fine. God instituted marriage. He said it's not good that man should be alone. I will make him an helpmeet for him. And so we're not trying to discourage people from getting married. We're trying to encourage all of us, if we're not married yet, to think about it very carefully, make the proper sacrifices involved, and do the work that's necessary in order to have a good marriage. And throughout this quarter, we're talking about things like that, and hopefully some of it will stick with us, and we will try to do the things necessary to have a good marriage. But I'm not trying to discourage people from getting married, but there is a risk involved in getting married. We need to realize that there are risks involved. Mackie and I were counseling with a couple on one occasion. Both were members of the church. The man had been unfaithful to his wife, and she had left him. And we were trying to help them get back together and get that thing straightened out. And we encouraged this lady to forgive the man. He was willing to come back, make things right, and be faithful to her. But she said, I don't want to hurt anymore. And I understand that. She was afraid that she'd be taking a big risk if she took him back, got married, stayed together again. He may hurt her again. But I said it's worth the risk. There is a risk involved when you get married the first time. You don't know how it's going to do the first time. But if you divorce and try to get back together, you will be taking a risk. You don't know if it's going to work out again or not. But it's worth the risk. If you can make that thing work right, if we follow the Bible, we can do that, and it's worth the risk. So we need to realize that there are some things to think about after we get married and be willing to pay the price, work hard at it to make things work together for good. So there are some things that can cause marriages to come apart. They may stay together then, but it will not be a happy marriage. But then number two, there are some things that can fracture a marriage. Now, there's several things that can cause a marriage to have big trouble and cause it to end in a divorce. One thing is merely getting married on the basis of good looks. If a person marries another only because that's a good-looking woman or man, that's not the basis on which we ought to get married. I say only. Now, it'd be good for a woman to look good to a man, but remember, one man's dreamboat may be another person's nightmare. She ought to look good to you. He ought to look good to you. But that marriage should not take place only because that person is good looking. If I ask you today, what part of our country has the greatest percentage of good-looking women and good-looking men? What would you say? Where would you go to find the greatest percentage of good-looking women and men? Where? Texas. I believe Hollywood would be the place, wouldn't it? When you think about a lot of good-looking women, good-looking men, Hollywood. Let me ask you a second question. What part of our country has the greatest percentage of divorces and breakups and marriage? Where would that be? Hollywood. Same place. They have the greatest percentage of good-looking women, good-looking men, and yet they have the greatest number of divorces. You remember Elizabeth Taylor? She was a good-looking woman. You know how many times she'd been married by the time she died? 9 times. Mickey Rooney, I think, had been married 8 times when he died. That's what I say. Now, you think about that. Yeah, everybody could have said that. Now, you think about it. Those people change mates about as often as we change clothes, seem like. They change mates quite often. So, what I'm saying is, good looks will not necessarily make a good marriage. So, a person should not marry somebody only because he looks good or she looks good. You remember in 1 Samuel chapter 16, Saul had died, and God sent Samuel to the house of Jesse to anoint one of his sons as the next king of Israel. And Jesse had several sons, and they came before Samuel, and Samuel looked at one of them and said, man, this must be the one. This must be God's anointed. But in verse 7 we read, but the Lord said unto Samuel, look not on his countenance or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord seeth not as man seeth, for man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. Now, that principle should be true in regard to picking a mate, too. We ought not to just look on the outward appearance, but we need to look into the heart, what that person really is. In Proverbs 31 and verse 30, Solomon said, favor is deceitful and beauty is vain, but the woman that feareth the Lord, she shall be praised. We ought to pick out someone who is good, not just good looking. Now, good looking is an asset, but that's not the main thing a person needs to look for. There must be a strong moral sense, unconditional commitment to the will of God, living for Christ. When we find a person like that, then if he or she is good looking, that's just something extra, and that's good, but we need to be concerned about what that person is, look into the heart, not just on the outside. And then there's always the problem of those who bring bad attitudes and bad habits to a marriage. Now, throughout this quarter, we'll be talking about a number of these things, so we won't mention all of them today, but just to cause us to think about it. And along the way, we'll be talking about some of them a little more. Among the bad attitudes are suspicion. If a husband and wife are suspicious of their mate and wonder if he may be committing adultery or she may be, that marriage is in trouble. We must base a marriage upon confidence in each other. If you don't have confidence in that person, you better not marry him or her. And then there is argumentativeness. If a person has that tendency, that marriage is going to have many opportunities to get into a fuss. There's some people who can start an argument in an empty room. And if you marry someone like that, you're going to have trouble, you see. And then there's a problem of selfishness. And this is one of the basic problems. It's behind most things. When we get married, we need to be concerned about the other person, not just ourselves. You know, in the word wedding, the we comes before the I. Spell wedding, W-E-D-D-I-N-G. We comes before the I. That's the way it ought to be in a wedding, in a marriage. We, not I. Selfishness has caused many of the problems in a marriage. And then irritability. If a person is always irritable, looking for a fuss, there will be many opportunities when they'll be able to do that. So we don't need to be irritable. And then vindictiveness. There are those who want to punish their mate because of their feelings. I read about a man who came home late from work one day, came home about 6 o'clock. Normally he came home 10 o'clock when he normally would come home at 6 o'clock. She thought he was probably out fooling around with another woman. When they went to bed that night, she set the clock. She would normally set it for 6 o'clock. That's when he'd get up and go to work. But she set it at 2 o'clock. It woke him up. He said, "Why in the world did you set the clock for 2 o'clock?" She said, "Well, it took you 4 hours to come home yesterday. I thought it might take you 4 hours to go back to work this morning." Now, when we have attitudes like that, a vindictive attitude, the marriage itself is going to become unraveled and fall apart. And then that idea of being suspicious of the mate. There was a man who came home late one night, and his wife thought he must have been out running around with another woman. So she got his coat and checked all over to see if she could find evidence that some other woman had been with him. She couldn't find a red hair, or blonde hair, or brunette hair, black hair. She couldn't find a woman's long hair on his coat. And she said, "So now you're going with bald-headed women." There are people who are very suspicious, and that can cause a marriage to unravel. Now, in Philippians 4, verse 8, Paul gives some instructions that will apply in every area of our lives. Philippians 4 and 8, "Therefore, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue and if there be any praise, think on these things." A husband and wife needs to have positive thinking. Look on the positive side rather than the negative side if we become suspicious of something. That will help a marriage. Not only are there bad attitudes, but there are bad habits as well. Addiction to drugs or alcohol can destroy marriage. I have counseled with many couples when there was a drug problem or a drinking problem. Of course, for Christians, there ought not to be a drinking problem at all. Not just drinking too much, but a Christian ought not to be drinking at all. But there are many couples that have trouble even with drugs. I remember a young man who would pretend to have a great pain. He would go to the emergency room at the hospital, tell him he was in great pain, and he wanted something for his pain, and they'd give him a pill for the pain. He said he was a pillaholic. I asked him if he was a drug addict. He said, no, he's a pillaholic. And he was. And we had to work on that to try to get him to give that up in order to save their marriage. But there are many marriages that fall apart, they're broke entirely because of drinking or drugs. And then there's a problem of reckless spending. Sometimes a husband or a wife can just spend more than they make. I remember a couple with which I worked. The wife was like that. She was spending more than he could earn. And finally that marriage broke apart. And as I was thinking about that, I thought of a lady who said to her husband one day, "Honey, I just hatched our nest egg." Spent all their money, you see. And then sometimes there's a problem of laziness. Sometimes on the part of a man, sometimes a woman. But if people are lazy, not willing to work, then that's going to cause a marriage to come apart. And then there is irresponsibility. Sometimes people get married when they're not mature. I read recently about a man out in Texarkana, Texas. I don't know when it happened, but I read it recently. A man divorced his 15-year-old wife because he said she was acting like a child. She was acting like a child because she was a child. People need to be old enough, mature enough when they get married so they won't be irresponsibility. Well, there are a number of things like that, and along the way this quarter we'll be talking about some other things, but these are some of the things that can cause a marriage to come apart, end up in divorce. But I want to get to something practical now from someone who's not a preacher, not a Christian. Judge Mildred Lilly was a judge over divorce courts. She had a lot of experience, and she's given a list of major causes of trouble between husbands and wives. First of all, she gave some causes of problems in the home on the part of the wife. Remember, I didn't write these. I'm just telling you what she said. Nagging. Now, we've talked about that. We know what's involved. Insufficient interest in the home. Sometimes a home gets into trouble because the wife primarily is not concerned about keeping it neat and clean. I was counseling with one couple like that and trying to encourage her to be willing to make some adjustments to make their marriage work. And she said, "Well, I'll cook his food for him, and I'll wash his clothes for him, and I'll go to church with him, but I won't promise to keep the house neat and clean." Well, needless to say, couldn't do much with that marriage if she was not willing to bend a little bit on that. And this woman who's a judge says sometimes that causes problems in marriages. And then carelessness about personal attractiveness and physical relationships of marriage. Sometimes people are divorced because a wife is a little careless along that line. I read about some woman who was looking at herself in the mirror, and her husband's sitting there reading the paper, and she said, "You know, I've got the body of a 20-year-old. And he said, without even looking up, "You better give it back. You're getting it all wrinkled." Age can cause the good looks to fade away. And if a marriage is based only upon good looks, it's going to fall apart. So we need to be careful about things like that. And then sometimes belittling husbands before other people. I knew about a case in which the man was not as educated as a woman, and he didn't know an adverb from an adenoid, and she was constantly having to correct him when he used bad grammar. They were in a crowd of couples on one occasion, and they were talking about what they had eaten that day, and this man said, "Well, I ate 7 biscuits this morning." When his wife heard him use that word "ate," she said, "8, dear." He said, "Maybe it was 8 biscuits I ate this morning." Then after everybody left, he said to his wife, "If you correct me in front of other people again, I'm going to hit you so hard, it'll be 3 weeks before I see you again." And it was. He barely saw out of one eye then, about 3 weeks. Sometimes marriages come apart because wives are constantly correcting the husband in front of other people. That tears down his self-image, and can cause real problems in a home. And I heard a man tell this story. I want to tell you because I think it illustrates the point, though it has some errors in it. A man died, and his wife wanted to talk to him one more time. She had heard that a psychic could put her in touch with the dead, so she went to a psychic. And during the session, she heard her husband's voice, and she said, "Is that you, Peter?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Are you happy where you are?" He said, "Yes, happier than I've ever been." And she said, "You're happier than you were when you were living with me?" He said, "Yes." She said, "You mean you're happier in heaven than you were living with me?" And he said, "I'm not in heaven." You can guess where he was. Well, women can help or hurt a marriage. And so women need to realize they have a part in this thing. And we need to listen to somebody like this judge who ran across all these problems like this in her work. Not that she's a Christian and speaking to us about Christianity, but those are practical things. Then there are problems on the side of husbands. Excessive drinking. Now, she's speaking from the standpoint of people in general who drink. Christians should have a problem with drinking at all. And then refusal to let wives handle funds. I told you last week about this young man who wouldn't give his wife any money, even to buy milk for a little baby when he went off to work. There are marriages that break apart because the husbands will not allow their wives to deal with the money at all. And then refusal to assume home responsibilities. This judge is saying that there are some men who just will not accept any responsibility in helping in the home. And that can cause problems between husbands and wives. And then there's the idea of a man being a tyrant, demanding that his wife do this or that to please him, not concerned about her or anybody else. And so if we have that attitude in a marriage, it can cause a marriage to break up very quickly. And then spending too much time away from home. Husbands can do that. I have known of marriages that were in trouble because the husband spends so much time away from home. He may be going hunting or golfing or doing other things. Whatever it is, he needs to do things with good judgment. I wish I had time to tell you about a case I dealt with like that. A man from Washington took his little girl when he had her. They were apart, but he had her. Came to Orlando, Florida. The wife didn't know where they were. I'll just let you think about that. Maybe I can tell you in the future because it emphasizes the fact that a husband can spend time away from home and destroy his home, and he can end up in jail like he did down there in that situation. So we can be too busy, and it can cause a marriage to break apart. Now, the more one loves Christ and his kingdom, the greater his capacity for expressing his love to his mate, and the greater his chances to succeed in marriage. It's a matter of becoming Christians, being Christians, really being faithful. Now, number 3, there are some things that will fuse a marriage. We've talked about some things that will unravel a marriage, and there are some things that will break up a marriage, and then there are some things that will fuse a marriage, bind them together. They're attitudes and qualities which help to make a marriage work. Let me just mention a few. We're not going to have time to get into a number of these, but let me just mention a few for you to think about. Love, of course, is first. Husbands and wives all love each other, as we've read. Love each other. And then fidelity. They must be faithful to each other. Loyalty. Their loyalty must be to their mate, not to your mom and daddy, but to your mate. And then there must be kindness. I believe if husbands and wives were as kind to each other as they are to people outside their family, we wouldn't need divorce courses. Sometimes we are unkind to each other when we ought to be kinder to our mates than to anyone else on earth. There was a teacher who was teaching a class of little children, and she was trying to help them to recognize animals. She drew a deer on the board and asked the children, "What is that?" And the children were just very small. One of them said, "Is that a dog?" She said, "No." Another said, "Is that a cat?" She said, "No." And she realized she needed to help them a little bit. She said, "What does your mother call your father?" One little boy said, "Is that a skunk?" That's the situation in many homes. Husbands and wives are unkind to each other. And after a while, it can split us up. So we need to be kind to each other, and it'll fuse marriages together. And then there's sympathy. Husbands and wives ought to have sympathy for each other in the work they do. And sometimes we men don't have much sympathy for our wives when they stay at home and work, take care of the kids and all these things. We need to have sympathy for them. And the wife needs to have sympathy for the husband in his work. And then there is sacrifice. They need to be willing to sacrifice what I want for the good of the family. Patience. And of course, that's one of the real needs in our homes. We need to be patient with each other. Wisdom. There's so many things like that just deal with everyday Christianity. And if we pay attention to those things, we can make our marriages better. Obviously, these are qualities that work in other relationships, not just in our homes. Now, again, I want to be a little more practical and tell you what a judge says. Judge Joseph Sabath of Chicago's Court of Domestic Appeals gave the following rules for a successful marriage. Now, he's not a Christian so far as I know, but he's basing this on his experience in divorce court. Number one, bear and forbear. There are things we just have to accept and live with them. When Mackie and I married, and we went to Harding, we didn't have any money. I didn't even have a car. I married her for a car. And we didn't have much money. We had one toothpaste tube between us. And I'd always squeeze the toothpaste tube from the bottom. You know, it looks better when you come up like that. She would start at the top or in the middle, and that'd be the biggest rag you ever saw, you know. And I just had to live with it. I just had to learn to forbear and bear that thing until we got enough money to buy 2 toothpaste tubes, you know, and that solved the problem. So we just need to bear and forbear some things until we can find a solution to the problem. Number 2, he said, work together and grow up together. Oftentimes we marry when we're not really grown up yet, and so we have to work together and grow up together. Number 3, avoid the little quarrels, and the big ones will take care of themselves. That's true, isn't it? Big problems are usually little problems that got out of hand. We didn't solve them until they became big. If we will take care of those little problems, they won't become big problems. And then number 4, practice sympathy, good humor, and mutual understanding. I believe that one thing that husbands and wives need is a good humor. You have to have a good sense of humor. You can deal with things if you can do that. There was a man and his wife riding out in the country, and one said something that caused a little ripple, and they began to fuss, and they grew bigger and bigger, and they came by a pasture, and they saw a number of mules out there in the pasture. You've heard the expression, stubborn as mules. He saw those mules out there in the pasture, and he said to his wife, "Are those some of your kin folks?" She said, "Yes, by marriage." That's a pretty good answer to it, isn't it? It's good to have a good sense of humor. Number 5, compromise. You have to have some give and take. Some people say that marriage is a 50-50 proposition. No, it's not. If it's a 50-50 proposition, you can have the biggest fuss and fight on the 50-yard line, but it's 100 and 100. Be willing to give 100%, each one. If you do that, willing to compromise, you can solve any problem. And then, number 6, don't grouch before breakfast or after it. Just don't be a grouch at all. Now remember, this is a judge who's dealt with all of these things in divorce courts. Number 7, respect your in-laws. Don't criticize them. Don't take criticism from them. Get out of the situation. Don't let your in-laws cause your marriage to go on the rocks. Brother E.R. Brannan used to say, the difference between in-laws and outlaws is that outlaws are wanted. That's a good thought, isn't it? We need to be careful not to let our in-laws destroy our marriages. And then again, establish your own home, even in a one-room flat. When I was talking to young people about making preparation for marriage, I suggested it would be good for you to go out and establish your own home, even if it's a little one-room shack, and don't live with mom and daddy. If you do that, you can have trouble with in-laws. It'd be better to live by yourself. When Mackie and I married, we married one night and left the next morning on our honeymoon going to Harding. The honeymoon was going to Harding. And we had made arrangements to rent a married student apartment there. Harding had bought some of these Army barracks from the Army, may have been from the Civil War, it looked like, and they brought them on campus, and they put walls every 12 feet or so in those things and made married student apartments out of them. One room. You come in the front door, didn't have a back door. You come in the front door, that's the living room. Didn't have room for a chair. It's a living room, though. And on the right, in this corner, the bed. That's the bedroom. And on that corner was the kitchen. Very small thing. We did have a chandelier in there. The light from the light fixture was hanging down over the table like that, you know. We said, that's our chandelier. And in this corner was a bathroom. Very small, you can imagine. One room, about the size of your living room. But we were happy. And we lived 800 miles from our parents. And we didn't have any problems there. So it would be good not to live with mom and daddy. Number 8, establish your own home even in a one-room flat. Then fight for each other, but not with each other. Fight for each other. Stand up for each other. I believe it was Brother Ira North that I heard talking about this point one time. And he said he moved to a place to preach. And he said in the very beginning, now you can criticize me all you want, but my wife is off limits. Don't criticize her. We ought to have that attitude in our marriages. Stand up for our wives. Fight for them, but not with them. And then number 10, build your home on religious faith with love and forgiveness as the watchword. Now remember, this man, so far as I know, was not a Christian. He was just a judge who's dealt with all of these problems. And he was talking from the standpoint of practical things. He'd run into all these problems. And so those 10 rules would be good for any of us. They'd help us to have a good marriage. In her book, Christian Romance and Marriage, Gertrude Nostrom has this paragraph. I want to share this paragraph with you. I think it is good. No matter how much one has in the way of education, wealth, social status, or physique, the basic contribution to the marriage will be his own character and personality. Beauty may be an asset, but time will cause it to fade. Intellectual attainment is desirable, but a person may be socially intelligent without formal study. You don't have to have a master's degree or PhD in order to have good judgment in dealing with people, you see. And then she said, emotional maturity is certainly essential to a permanently happy marriage. We need to be mature people. The ability to get along with people, the ability to face both routine and crises without becoming upset, the ability to subordinate self-interest for the common good. These are some of the materials of which a successful marriage is built. I believe those are good words, helpful to us. This reminds us of some even more profound words. These words are by an inspired apostle. I think it'd be good to read 1 Corinthians 13, verses 4 through 7, and I would urge you to get a modern speech translation because it generally puts it down into cornbread language so we can really understand it. Let me read it from the Phillips translation. This love of which I speak is slow to lose patience. It looks for a way of being constructive. It is not possessive. It is neither anxious to impress, nor does it cherish inflated ideas of its own importance. Love has good manners and does not pursue selfish advantage. It is not touchy. It does not keep account of evil or gloat over the wickedness of other people. On the contrary, it is glad with all good men when truth prevails. Love knows no limits to its endurance, no end to its trust, no fading of its hope. It can outlast anything. It is, in fact, the one thing that still stands when all else has fallen. I believe the words of Paul are more valuable even than what those judges said, though they are very practical. Love one another. Husbands and wives, love each other. Children, love your parents. Parents, love your children. Well, our time is up. I appreciate the way you've listened today. Next week, we'll go a little deeper in some of these things, and we hope you'll be back for that study. Good to have you.